Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar From Big Data to the Big Picture with librarians Caroline Muglia and Jill Parchuck. My name is Melissa Crowley, and I'm a Senior Marketing Manager at SAGE for SAGE Research Methods. Let me begin by introducing you to our speakers. Caroline Muglia is the Head of Resource Sharing and Collection Assessment Librarian at the University of Southern California. She manages the Interlibrary Loan and Document Delivery Department and leads the collection assessment efforts for the library. Before this position, Caroline worked at the Library of Congress and later as a data librarian for an educational technology company. Jill Parchuck has been the Associate University Librarian for Science, Social Science, and Medicine at Yale University since 2014. Other positions Jill has held at Yale include Director of Science and Social Science Libraries and co-director of the Center for Science and Social Science Information from 2010 to 2014, and Director of Social Science Libraries and Information Services from 2007 to 2010. This one-hour webinar will be recorded and archived for future viewing. We will be sending out a link to view it and to access the slides to all registrants in the coming weeks. If you have any problems with audio or viewing mode during the webinar, please use the Q&A box at the right of your screen, and one of our helpful team members will get back to you ASAP. At the end of the webinar, we will have some time for Q&A from attendees, so please also use the Q&A box to ask any questions to speakers throughout the webinar. Please also take note of the webinar hashtag, SageTalks, and feel free to ask questions or leave comments there. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to Caroline.
Hi all, thank you so much for being here. Colleges and universities are engaging in big data projects. That's probably why you're all on this webinar, to talk more about that. On campuses, those initiatives are often not happening in concert with one another. So today we'll be sharing examples of our work from our institutions. The focus of this webinar is really to showcase a few ways that libraries and librarians can intersect with big data work and even initiate projects throughout the library. In each section, Jill and I offer some guiding questions, some of which we'll address, but mostly they comprise a kind of checklist that can be instructive when embarking on big data projects. So just a note about these two universities, Yale has been engaging in this kind of work for a long time. And you'll see that in the kind of infrastructure and the examples that Jill has provided, and also how Jill sort of talks about the work. On the other hand, USC represents a school where a lot of big data initiatives are happening all over campus, but where the libraries are only now getting involved. And so we thought that kind of juxtaposition of those two universities might be really instructive in how to kind of do different work and the kind of questions to ask. Slide advancement, please. So the areas we'll cover today include data sets, both homegrown and purchased, licensing data, storage and repositories. We're going to talk a little bit about software and tools, and then we'll offer some next steps, kind of looking ahead and future considerations. And then finally, as Melissa suggested, we'll take some questions. So the definition of big data is often described in terms of a set of characteristics. The first is volume. So big data differs from regular data in that the size of the data sets are huge. Big data is loosely defined as, and this definition comes from Mark Barogel, whose name I probably didn't pronounce correctly, is defined as data that cannot be stored or analyzed by conventional hardware and software. So traditional software can handle megabytes and kilobytes. Big data tools can handle terabytes and petabyte size data sets, so much, much bigger. The second characteristic is related to variety. And so this makes big data sets more challenging to organize and to analyze. Big data sets can contain unstructured data like email or photographs or phone transcripts. It's really the number of types of data involved. The third characteristic is velocity. So a great example of this is social media. how many tweets are created in an hour or a day. Of course, there are many, many examples. But velocity is really the speed at which the data is being both created and processed. And then finally, a little newer on the scene is value. So this asks, how is the data being used and how is it being reused? So the value is really in the analysis that's being done with the data rather than just the data itself. We've also read about additional kind of V's that have been used as characteristics to describe big data, including veracity and even variability. And so that's really to say that this is sort of the working definition that we use, but it's constantly changing, I think, in the same way that big data is constantly changing. Slide. Okay. So homegrown data sets. So researchers at all levels may be working with data that they have gathered, pulling data together from a variety of sources or ranges of time, doing lab research. Oh, I'm very sorry, Jill, that's yours.
That's okay. Thank you, Caroline. This is Jill. Good afternoon. I'd like to mention just a few things about homegrown data sets. These are some things to consider related to homegrown data sets. Researchers at all levels may be working with data that they have gathered, so it's important to realize that the level of expertise may vary greatly from undergraduates to the most experienced postdoc or faculty member. They may be pulling data together from a variety of sources and over many ranges of time. So for instance, it's not unusual to hear a researcher say they need all of the data on something for the past century. That's a question we had recently related to some economic data. They may be doing lab research that generates its own results as data. They may also be gathering data from people via surveys, interviews, focus groups, or other means. Caroline mentioned a few things like looking at tweets and other kinds of social media. The institution itself is also a source of data in which many may be interested. This may include things such as enrollment data, data about utilities usage, dining hall metrics, funding sources, sustainability efforts, and many others. And I can say from personal experience, some of that data is of great interest to the researchers on campus when they look at broader topics like sustainability. Next slide. Where the data can be stored for homegrown data should be considered very carefully. I want to say this right up front. There may be security issues around homegrown data also. Possibilities for storage of homegrown data include, but are not limited to, some of the following. Offsite storage, for instance, in the cloud or at the institution of a collaborator, and a national or international discipline-specific repository or an open repository, and a central campus repository if there is one, and servers on campus which may be maintained in a department, at the library, and campus IT, and probably many, many other places. It may be stored on hard drives in a researcher's office. It can also be stored on a laptop that might have lots of storage available to it. This slide shows a few examples of the kinds of places data is stored at Yale and USC. It represents a variety of sources of data, as you can see, including that coming from researchers, institutional data, and data coming directly from the library. It also includes a variety of data topics, such as social science and policy data, spatial science data, history and
might be helpful to you are taking into consideration the format that the library receives the data sets in. Where those data sets are stored becomes very important. the kind of access that users have or that you want them to have to these data sets. And then, of course, in terms of discoverability, that's really important in libraries, of course. Slide advancement, please. Thanks. So this is a slide that really just gives a quick understanding of kind of the workflow at our institution. So the subject specialist, the librarian, the subject expert receives a request from researchers and places an order, right, to purchase, to subscribe to this data set. Data librarians, or really someone who's managing the data at that point in your library, will then be the person who receives it and manages it and then places it either on a local server, but of course this can vary. It can be a local server, it can be vendor hosted. Here at USC, we use Amazon Web Services for a lot of our hosting. And then, of course, catalogers create records for the online discovery system. And the kind of findability of data sets is incredibly important. And it's also, I think, a unique asset to librarians or by librarians. We're really good at making things discoverable. And I think that's constantly a new thing that we can be bringing to these larger initiatives is, okay, you figured some of this stuff out, but how are you going to make it discoverable and continuously discoverable for researchers? So that's part of kind of the scholarly conversation. Slide.
So much like our other digital collections, licensing is a big thing when it comes to data that we acquire, whether it's purchasing or being given it or however we receive it. We must consider the terms of use and access versus ownership. When acquiring data from a vendor, or it may be acquired from a research institute or from a foreign government or anywhere, we must consider licensing issues just as we do for other collections. The questions we ask are very similar, and you may be able to use standard license models. However, the license terms may be different and more complex for data. Often, the vendor is accustomed to working only with individual researchers or corporate clients. So the license may not be designed to address the preferred campus access environment. Next slide. Some of the basic issues that should be considered specifically for licenses for data include some of these following. Indemnification and the place of adjudication of a license, they're kind of standard for most digital products, but this can be a sticky point for data as well. Who can use the data should be addressed, and we would typically want the widest possible range of access, including the entire campus and not just one or two users. However, and I have encountered this a few times with data, it may be necessary to settle for limited use of the data instead of no access at all. It comes right down to how well do we support our researchers and what can we realistically do. The platform on which the data is provided must also be considered. Some issues related to the platform include, if it is web access, does it have authentication requirements? Can the data be downloaded easily from the web? Are there special APIs or plugins necessary to use the data, and can we support those? Is any special software necessary to use the data or in which to import the data? Metadata is also important for access to content, so we will want that for the data acquired. As Caroline mentioned, we're good at providing access, and librarians often think about that. We should ask the vendor if they provide metadata, and if so, what kind, to make sure that it complies with the systems into which we might want to put that metadata. If the vendor does not provide metadata, we should be prepared to create that locally, and that provides some very special kinds of expertise, metadata, cataloging, systems requirements, etc. Retention of a backup copy of data should be considered for long-term access or in case of disaster. Disaster might mean anything from an accidental loss of the original copy of the data to the company going out of business. We should also ask if the provider has a backup long-term access method. You'll need to determine if that method meets your institutional standards. If it does not, we can ask the vendor or provide us with a backup copy to be stored locally. In this case, you will need to determine the method of delivery and the local storage and access options. Next slide.
So now that we sort of have all this data, where does it go? So storage and repository, some of the guiding questions that were important to us include how much storage space is needed, and not just in that moment, but kind of moving forward. If you're building your data repository and you're getting more involved in big data initially, your storage space is going to increase. And so understanding that over time is vitally important. And then what do we need the repository to do? So essentially, what are its functions? And as you know, is becoming clear, there are a lot of functions of repositories because data is so dynamic. So slide. This slide provides a bunch of examples, and if it wasn't clear from the beginning, once these slides are sent out, these are all linked, and so you'll be able to go click into them and find a lot more information. But on the Yale end, the Registry of Research Data Repositories, just as an example, lists 1,500 different research data repositories. It's considered among the most comprehensive lists out there, and you can browse by subject or by content type or even by country the different types of research data repositories out there. And when I was playing around with this, just sort of as a plug, the visual search is a very cool and neat kind of visual display, and so it's worth going in there just for that. The ICPSR, that's on both of our lists for political and social research, and that is sort of social and behavioral research that's based out of the University of Michigan. It maintains a really substantial data archive that's searchable, and then for all of those listeners out there who are interacting with students, it offers a lot of student resources. And then just to kind of round out the Yale side, the Yale Social Science Data Archive, and all of that information is available in the local discovery system, which again is a really sort of unique asset that librarians can bring to the table when talking about big data initiatives. At USC, we have the USC Digital Repository, which really the focus is on preservation with some access, but that's not really the point. The point is more in terms of preservation. In terms of departments and schools, and again, I think this is likely a function of USC having a lot of really neat big data initiatives going on around campus, but the library is not getting too involved, at least until recently. Some departments and schools contract with repositories or they purchase server space from the university. And so it's really up to the department or the school to come up with their data storage plan. Rather than working with the libraries where maybe a checklist or some sort of infrastructure can be built out to help those services. And then I added smaller data sets, and I know this is a webinar about big data exclusively, but sometimes smaller data sets turn into bigger data sets, or a lot of small data sets sort of come together as big data sets. But we have learned through conversation that a lot of professors and even some small centers on campus have hard drives that contain raw data that they keep in their offices or in the departmental library. So this might be happening at your university. And you know, with more capacity, the library really could take a more active role in helping to manage this data. But right now, we are sort of aware that this is happening, and that's really about it. And so, but that's something that we are keeping our eye on in terms of how people are already storing things and how they're already interacting or engaging with repositories on campus. Slide.
So related to supporting big data are the issues around services for analyzing data and storing it, et cetera. Clearly stated and recorded somewhere. Whether or not there are privacy issues related to the data must also be considered. For example, if it includes personal data, has that data been de-identified? Is there a place to safely store it? What the researcher needs to do or how the data will be used must be considered in terms of what or how much analysis assistance may be necessary. Some researchers may be experts at analysis and some may have no experience with it at all. Much like many research projects, one may begin thinking that they would like to use all the data in every way possible. It's best to be prepared to help researchers understand what they may need and other possible ways of framing their approach to using the data. This is very much like what we do in a standard research consultation. Who will be using the data should also be considered. Is it to be used by one researcher, a group of researchers, or a larger audience? This could have big impact on what the access modes may need to be, and that may also relate to the security related to that data. This will help in determining where the data should be stored and how it can be accessed. The output options for data are as important as input. The format in which the data has been stored and the software or code needed to use the data are keys to ongoing use and future reuse of it. It's important to be able to support and plan for these output options. Some activities that may be necessary to support the use of data include organizing and cleaning of data, which are vital to effective use and reuse of it. It's highly likely that data, numerical data in particular, will require some statistical analysis. This may include use of standard software for statistical analysis, or it may require special programming or creation of special code. Manipulation of data may be necessary to address the research problem posed, so special reorganization of data to represent specific perspective may be required. Visualization of data and the theory it represents may require a variety of methods, including charts, graphs, timelines, images, networks, and many other options. To do this visualization, special software may be needed. For example, something like Tableau. Using the best method of visualization is as important as the original research itself. And I'm sure we've all seen many examples of bad data visualization to prove that point. Retention of data is important for access to the data. Advice about how to provide access in the future is crucial to any researcher's data so that they will be able to get at it again and so that they can share it, or it may be addressed by others in the future. Slide. This slide shows some examples of the types of data that are stored at Yale and USC. You can see it provides a wide range of types of data, everything from basic identification of need for data to the provision of high-performance computing. These services may be provided by a range of staff members across the library and across the campus. And as Carolyn and I discussed this, we realized that our librarians provide varying degrees of support for these things, and we partner with a lot of different people. Partnerships among those who provide support for using data are crucial. These partnerships are the essence of a good referral system so that researchers get the full support they need in a timely way. Slide.
So what can you do now? So as we look ahead, especially for librarians who are just starting to engage with big data projects, we wanted to leave you a little bit with kind of what are the entry points, and that those entry points that are specific to librarians or people working in libraries. Slide. So there are kind of three main areas that I'm going to work through. The first is really identifying the unique role that the library can play. So information management is a library service, and we should all embrace that paradigm if we haven't already. And that's really important because if we think about it as part of our kind of core responsibilities and tasks, and even sort of what the library itself is bringing to a university or to an institution, I think it'll make it easier to sort of invite in big data projects. And in addition, I think it will empower librarians to kind of take on those roles. Sort of going back to basics, data literacy is vitally important, especially, what Jill was just talking about in terms of sort of services for analyzing big data. This is work that we have been doing maybe at a smaller scale for a long time. Librarians are really great at this. So teaching with data is an example from USC. And then the data education link is an example from Yale. And these are real examples of getting involved in instruction or reference that's just related to how to approach data, what is good data, what is poorly formed data, and then also related to data visualization, as Jill mentioned. And so if we can kind of reincorporate data literacy and angle it toward big data, we're already halfway there in really playing a critical role in big data endeavors. We talked about Tableau as a tool, but really becoming expert trainers in different visualization tools and insofar as they intersect with big data projects, text and data mining tools. I know here at USC, around the time that we started getting involved in sort of some big data conversations, we were also getting involved in conversations about text and data mining, in part people coming to the libraries because they wanted a large corpus of data that they could then mine. They didn't really care what it was, but they wanted the data. Or people who were looking for a more instructive role that the librarian could take in identifying tools that would work with their skill level. So learning, becoming expert trainers in that regard with Voyant or Mallet as text and data mining tools has sort of become part of the work that we're doing at the libraries and the kind of quote unquote services that we're providing. Sort of going also back to basics, having this metadata expertise. So as Jill pointed out, perhaps the metadata is coming from the vendor, or perhaps we're building that metadata, or maybe more likely it's a hybrid. But libraries do metadata really well, and we've been doing it for a long time. So why not apply that expertise to big data endeavors that are happening? Sort of related, being able to store or make accessible other departments' raw data. So maybe you sort of take a step back and you think, I'm not sure that we can become expert trainers or that we can augment our information literacy to include data literacy. But I know what we can do is create a plan to store, or we have the server space, or we have the infrastructure to store other people's raw data. That's a really great start, and it's something that I'm sure you'll find is really important. I know at USC, just that service alone is vitally important, including the external hard drives, but also people going to different vendors or to different outside sources to store the raw data, and then maybe not being able to access it as freely or as readily. And then really kind of the culmination of the unique role that a library can play is really asking the question, can librarians provide analytical services? And so essentially, how can we measure something new? How can we be part of the conversation rather than sort of serving as support or guidance in these conversations? What can we be doing to bring something fresh and new to big data? Maybe we can be analyzing big data. The kind of second section is learning the needs of the institution. And for most of us, this is pretty obvious, but let's apply it to big data projects. So digital humanities projects can be a sort of starting point. Not all digital humanities projects are big data projects and vice versa. But we have found in conversation with what's happening at Yale and at USC that digital humanities projects, they're usually an intersection with libraries or librarians in some regard. And so taking advantage of those entry points to get involved with either the people who are initiating or spearheading digital humanities projects, or even kind of taking on some of the elements or some of the deliverables of those projects can be a really neat starting point. And then, of course, throughout all of this, identifying the stakeholders. So maybe it's a department that's doing a lot of big And then finally, and this is not because this is a SAGE-sponsored webinar, but really vendors and librarians can act as research partners. We really have a unique relationship with vendors that a lot of other departments and schools and people at these institutions likely don't have. And we should leverage our relationship with vendors to help us get more involved in data projects, either as collaborators or as drivers of providing these analytical services. Vendors do product development. They have research and development departments. I don't know any libraries that have research and development departments. If we view vendors as research partners in this process, it really could provide a unique perspective that's different than what others on campus can bring. And that might be enough to really get libraries engaged in big data endeavors. Slide.
So for the future, there are many considerations we can make. And so I will mention a few things that are on the near horizon and some that are a little bit further out. The use of data in research is increasing and spreading across many disciplines. It's also increasing the opportunities for interdisciplinary work. Some examples of that include things like use of demographic data for history research, digital research projects. Yale has a famous photogrammer project that did exactly this. And then there's the use of data in things like public science and public humanities. Data research is greatly aided by ongoing development of software, hardware, access to data, and perhaps most importantly, the skills of researchers and the librarians who support them. Access to data, as you know, is vastly growing, and while we hear a lot about access to data coming from social media, there's also data that can be very easily pulled from some free sites, whether they're from the government or from some public producers of data themselves, so vendors, publishers, etc. So that increases the desire to use that data for something. The skills that are required for this, Caroline mentioned this a bit, a lot of this taps right into the natural abilities and skills and expectations of librarians. So one thing for the future we definitely need to think about is what those skills are, what they should be, and how we can get them there. Slide. So a few issues looking into the crystal ball of the future of big data are those that you see on the slide in front of you. Data management plans have been required by the government for NSF grants for a few years now. In the real world, we might expect that that demand will continue. It should be an expectation given that the research is supported by the government, the data should go along with what is provided as output. Other research funders are also likely to provide some of these data management plans. They particularly open access publishers, open access organizations, etc., have a lot of interest in providing not just the description and results of data of research, but also of the data that went along with it. Open data is exactly that. There's open government data. There's an example Caroline gives of the Los Angeles open city data. In New Haven, we have something called New Haven data, which provides a lot of data related to the county and the city. And then there's the Open Science Foundation, or the Open Science Framework, which provides if you will, an actual ecosystem for doing research, providing the research content, providing the research data, making it available to all for purposes of viewing, but also potential reproducibility. The third item in this future is data science. Data science has become a very popular topic on campuses. A greater emphasis is being placed on the need for researchers to have actual expertise with gathering, managing, analyzing, and storing data, meaning doing the actual lab work, the actual collection of data, is not sufficient, but one needs to also be able to figure out how to use that data, how to represent the outcome of it, and also to share it with others. New courses and majors in data science are being offered on campuses. Carolyn and I talked about this, and both Yale and USC have major programs in data science at this point. So since data science is a topic on campuses, I think the library can be expected to provide support for data science as it does for other disciplines by providing collection content, instruction in finding and using that content, and generally having familiarity with the tools and processes for data science itself. This represents an area where the future of the library may lie in supporting data science researchers and partnering with them. I'm sure there are many other things on the frontier of support for data on campuses, but these are just a few, but I'd love to hear what others may have to say. Thank you.
Okay, as we get ready to transition into the question and answer time, we have a couple of poll questions that we're going to put out for the audience to answer. And then just as a reminder, please send in your questions in their use tab. Okay, as the polls are going on, the first question is how can someone get started supporting big data? What are the first steps librarians should take?
This is Jill. I would jump into this. I think one of the first things we need to know is what is the environment for use of data and need of data on the campus. One can understand this better, one, by listening to our research support librarians. What kinds of questions are they getting related to data? But also potentially making it a very specific effort to get out and either survey or interview researchers to ask what kinds of data they're using and what they think their data needs may be.
This is Caroline. I completely agree with that, and I think that's the kind of smartest and most sustainable way to go. To kind of add to that a little bit, I think I might even offer sort of what the library or partner, because I wonder if there is a disconnect because there's these researchers and they're using data and they have all of these needs, and then they don't really look to the libraries for answers or for support or partnership. And so sort of along with asking those questions that Jill pointed out, I would also use it as an opportunity for outreach and say, this is what you're doing. That's really great. Thank you for telling me. In addition, these are what the library can do or have the capacity to do, or we want to pilot this thing with you. I think that could really get some mileage.
I think that's a great point. I would add to that also, I'm talking to others on campus who provide support for data. So a high performance computing facility, maybe somebody in campus IT. Sometimes that's the only way we discover where the gaps are. So you may know what your library provides, but then hearing what others provide and what they've been asked for, and identifying the places where there is no existing service, create the opportunity to either on the library's behalf themselves or partnering with these other organizations to create a new service.
We have a question on cataloging. Do you have thoughts on how data sets should be cataloged? It seems to me that describing the data sets in a way that helps advanced researchers locate the TBM sets, but not also sending undergraduates who really want access through standard library
the right kind of metadata. However, there are national and international standards for data cataloging, and that's what I think it's crucial that that be considered when you consider what metadata you're going to use and where you're going to put it.
Jill, this is Caroline. I have a question for you actually related to this, and maybe the person who asked this question, I'd be interested also to know what kind of, maybe you're in an academic university because it seems like most of the attendees are, but I'm wondering, are there good examples that you know of or that you've come across of libraries that are using those standards, those data cataloging standards that we could even kind of look to? I don't mean to put you on the spot. I don't have any, I don't know any, but perhaps you did.
I'm not totally confident in this answer, but I think Cornell has done some various work on, but then there are things like ICPSR, as we mentioned earlier, and some of that maybe probably are using some national and international standards that could be adopted locally.
Is the metadata for big data sort of any different than other types of data?
One thing I would suggest might be different is that some big data requires specific code and a code book or that sort of supporting information or you won't be able to use the data as the original researcher did. So I think that's one potential big difference. The other might be the specifics around the size of the data and the
Another question, what type of data science training would getting started with stewardship of data sets? I think what type of data science training would you recommend for getting started with stewardship of data sets?
I think that's a fantastic question. Something we provide at Yale is a couple of workshops on cleaning data and managing data. So very basic, that those workshops are for anybody at any level. So something as simple as that. I'm also aware that there's an online course, I think provided by Coursera, that Johns Hopkins offers. That's a pretty in-depth data science program. And I think there's everything in between those things.
Courses, Data Science Academy's data science certificates that you can do, and that might be a really great way to start. I would also ask that question if you are one of those institutions that we mentioned earlier where data science for students is really picking up. I know at USC there's data science majors as an undergraduate and as a graduate student, which is different than computer science, different than all these other things. And so I might even reach out to a professor or someone who's already involved in that to see what they would say. I know that at USC we are really just sort of learning this in the libraries specifically, and so we are also kind of looking around for different ways to become more educated on this topic, specifically related to data science and even kind of the different questions to ask or the different sort of the foundational stuff that we need to learn. So it could be interesting to reach out to someone who's been doing this and teaching this for a while.
In addition to ICPSR, do you recommend any other free or subscription databases for data sets to use for dissertation or for graduate students in the social sciences, psychology, counseling, business, and education.
This is Jill. I would have to say, for those topics, ICPSR is the one that's probably been around the longest and is the deepest. However, you could explore that that meta list of repositories that Caroline referred to in one of her slides and see what pops up there. Those are the major things I think off the top of my head.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions, thank you to everybody for joining us, and a special thank you to our speakers. In the coming weeks, please be on the lookout for an email from Sage that includes a link to view the entire webinar and slides, as well as answers to some of these questions. Please stay connected with us on our blog, Sage Connection, for information about upcoming webinars. Thank you so much.